How's everybody? My name is Eric Ryback. I'm a former Charlottesvillian, glad to be back this year, and I welcome everybody on behalf of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, the producer of the Virginia Festival of the Book. I also want to mention that we want to thank the city of Charlottesville for sponsoring the festival and providing this wonderful venue. This event is being recorded for broadcast on Charlottesville's own TV10. Will be available online at charlottesville.org/TV10. Also remember, when we get to the Q&A later, please raise your hand. I'll call on you and wait for the mic to be handed to you. Also, our friends at Book TV, C-SPAN, are recording this to be cablecast at a later date, so look for that. Please remember to silence your cell phones. If you are on Twitter, you can tweet at hashtag VABook2016. And remember that the festival is free of charge, not free of cost, so please remember to go online and give back or pick up a giving envelope from the information desk at the Omni and support your festival. Please also remember to fill out your program evaluations. These really are useful to the people who put the festival together. And you can fill out a paper evaluation before you leave or complete it online at vabook.org/survey. Do support festival authors and our local booksellers by purchasing a book today. And of course, our author will be available for book signing after the program. Our program this morning is titled Modern Science, Obsession, Paranoia, Jealousy, and Einstein. Bruce Hillman, the author of The Man Who Stalked Einstein, is a professor and former chair of radiology at UVA. He has published a number of short stories in literary journals and a book explaining medical imaging for lay readers. Einstein is his first book of creative nonfiction. So let's welcome Bruce Hillman.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
So with this whole background, how's it that you are now a creative nonfiction writer?
Yeah, it's if you look at the program, I look quite a lot different than the average first-time writer. I'm a little older, and hopefully I've learned something in the 68 years that I've been around. I actually owe my writing career to someone who was an associate dean at the University of Virginia Medical School, a woman named Sharon Hosler. I thought Sharon might be here today, but I guess she's elsewhere. Sharon ran just a 2-hour little program about writing as a pastime for physicians, and I had a spare couple of hours one day, went down, participated, and at the very end there was an exercise where they gave a sentence, and I was supposed to write, all of us were supposed to write a paragraph or two of a story that would be based on the sentence. And I did that, and I turned it in, and about a week later, I got a call from Sharon, and she said, really liked your paragraph. I've been running a critique group of about 6 or 7 women for a number of years here in Charlottesville, and we need a man. She wanted to know whether I wanted to try out, and so I wrote a story. I remember the stories. I remember the story still, called The Lemon. And they took me in. I was rough, but they worked on me, and they really made it not only that I enjoyed creative writing again, hadn't done any for many, many years, but that I learned so much about what better writing was than I could originally do. And so I owe this to them, and they still meet. I actually met with them a couple of days ago when I returned to Charlottesville. This book. And say, why this book? Why creative nonfiction? I actually was doing some lecturing out in Australia, and it turns out that it's a lot cheaper. Australia is about the most expensive trip you can take from the East Coast of the United States. It's much, much cheaper if you just keep going around the world. And there are all kinds of rules that you have to follow, but they all involve long hauls. And so my wife and I went out to Perth, and I lectured a little, and I started writing a novel. And I wrote that novel, just about finished it by the time the 28 days of going around the world had finished. Now, I still haven't found an agent for that novel, and that novel remains unpublished. It's a medical murder mystery that takes place out in Arizona, where I used to live. But I realized when somebody was interviewing me for my class, I went to Princeton as an undergraduate, somebody was writing my story for our website, and I said, well, he's a writer. I asked for his advice. He referred me to an agent in Tucson, and she said, well, I don't do fiction anymore, but if I like your writing, if you ever get a good nonfiction idea, I'd love to see it. And so I was still lecturing. I went out to Cambridge, England, and it's a long trip too, and I couldn't see just going for a lecture and coming back. So I spent a week. I got on a train. It took me to Aberdeen, Scotland. I got off the train and I played a famous golf course called Cruden Bay. And they hooked me up with a couple of Canadians who told me this story about their father. Their father had been a top-ranking general in the Canadian Army during World War II and had been attached to the nuclear testing at Alamogordo, New Mexico. And he'd been very fit and had led a great life, but all of a sudden at age 70, he caught this severe neurodegenerative disease, died within a year, and they wanted to know whether the testing had done it. And so I asked them a few questions. They said, protection? No, our dad said there wasn't any protection. They gave him a chaise lounge, they gave him some dark glass, and they said, watch this. And so I thought, well, this might be an interesting thing to write about, and I started researching it. And it shows you how luck can just come into play in any phase of life, certainly in science, which we might get into later on. I was going through some stuff related to nuclear testing, and I have no idea why I was in the pile, but there was this article from a 1946 American Journal of Rentgenology, crumpled yellow pages, and I read it. And it was about a man named Philippe Lonard, an American colonel. Hey, there's Sharon, I just mentioned you. So at any rate, there was this man, Philippe Lonard. He had been captured by the Allies, and an American colonel who was going to be a neuroradiologist asked, can I interview him about his relationship with Renkin, Wilhelm Conrad Renkin, the discoverer of the X-ray. Everybody thought, except here this man, Philippe Lonard, said, it wasn't Renkin at all. Renkin was simply the midwife who had had the pleasure of discovering the birth. I am the true mother of the X-ray. So this man clearly had some paranoid delusions, but he also had extraordinary narcissism. He was such an evil character, I thought to myself, wow, this is a great story, Renkin and Lonard. So I called the agent and I wrote up this, two-pager, and she sort of flogged it around some publishers, and they said, nobody's ever heard of Renkin. Isn't that an amazing thing? Talk about literacy. So I did a little more research, and I found that, but Renkin had just been a sidelight. The guy he really had it out for many years had been Albert Einstein. So I called her back. I said, anybody ever heard of Einstein? And so in the end, there were a couple of publishers who bid on it, and I wrote the book.
That's great. Would you like to give us a taste?
All right. Let me read a little from chapter 1. Sieg Heil! The man's cry found an echo in 1,000 others. On the clear, cool evening of May 11th, 1933, the crowd repeated the familiar Nazi greeting as ranks of university students marched past encouraging throngs of spectators into the vast expanse of Berlin's Opera Square. The students arranged themselves around an enormous blaze that the brown shirts of the Nazi SA had set and stoked into an inferno earlier in the evening. Sparks shot into the late spring night, their explosive barks all but drowned out by the cheers of more than 40,000 onlookers. Young faces reflected the heat of the bonfire and their excitement. At a signal, the front rows of students moved forward, stooped to gather armsful of books, and tossed them into the flames. They gave way to the students behind them, reciting as they did the prescribed verses each had committed to memory. Against class warfare and materialism, for the community of the people in an idealistic way of life, against decadence and moral degeneracy, for decency and custom in family and government. The ritual was repeated until the flames had consumed 25,000 books. Among the dozens of authors whose writings had been trucked from libraries to Opera Square early in the day were socialists like Karl Marx, social activists like Helen Keller, and humanists like Ernest Hemingway. Organizers also had removed from library stacks every copy they could find of the works of a number of Jewish scientists. Their revolutionary discoveries had helped elevate German science to the apotheosis of world recognition. Under the new Nazi regime, they had fallen out of favor. As the flames snapped and flexed in the wind and the logs fueling the blaze settled into embers, a lone figure limped up several steps to a roughly constructed platform fronting the square. The chief of Nazi propaganda, Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels, surveyed his audience. His sweating, lupine face gleamed in the shining light. When he sensed the crowd's anticipation has grown as taut as it could bear, he began to speak. The age of an overly refined Jewish intellectualism has come to an end, and the German Revolution has made the road clear again for the German character. In the past 14 years, comrades, as you have been forced in a silent shame to suffer the humiliations of the November Republic, the libraries became filled with trash and filth from Jewish asphalt literateurs. He paused to give the crowd space to roar its disapproval. You do well in these midnight hours to consign the unclean spirit to the past, to the flames. The old lies in the flames, but the new will arise from the flame of our hearts. Let it be an oath to many flames. Heil to the Reich and the nation and our leader Adolf Hitler. Goebbels shot the Nazi straight-arm salute, fingers extended, palm forward into the cool night air. As the deafening applause settled down, a group of students began to sing the Horst Wessel song, the anthem of the Nazi Party. The tune was picked up by other students and soon the surrounding thousands. The celebration was just beginning. It would continue long into the night.
So tell us a little more about Philippe Lonard.
Yeah. Has anybody here ever heard of Philippe Lonard? Yeah, it's an amazing, there's a gentleman, extraordinary. Hardly anybody has ever heard of this man, despite the fact that he was the Nobel Prize winner for physics in 1905. He was a man who was an arch experimentalist. He was very famous in his time. He'd won the Nobel Prize for his work with cathode ray tubes. He'd made a modification of the cathode ray tube that perhaps Renkin had even used, we don't know, but might have used that night, that allowed him to know about the X-rays. But he had some problems, this Lonard fellow. Einstein at one point talks to his student about how twisted Lonard seemed to him. He did have a severe narcissistic personality, but everything started out all right. Einstein was 17 years his junior. They had a very cordial, if very peripatetic, correspondence at one point in time. Einstein had done some work with the photoelectric effect, which Lonard had first described. In fact, Einstein's law of the photoelectric effect is what he was awarded the Nobel Prize for, not for relativity. At any rate, though, that began to degenerate, first because of this student, Jakob Johann Loeb, one of Lonard's students, who initially started out thinking Lonard quite the fellow, just as Einstein did, but over time realized that he had some odd quirks. He was a habitually difficult person who made his students work on things they didn't even believe in, and such was the case with Loeb. And over time, things between Einstein and Lonard disintegrated. At first, it was mainly a scientific difference. As I said, Lonard was an arch experimentalist. Einstein, of course, was the best known ever theoretician, physics theoretician. Lonard came to believe that the whole theoretical physics, mathematically derived formula was a hoax, that in fact it was a Jewish hoax. It was something that had no grounding in real life, and that perhaps the Jews who were the foremost in this field didn't even intend for it to be true, that the whole thing was charlatanry simply to get jobs and to become famous and popular. And that did occur, and we can take up the story from there if you like, or you may have other questions.
No, go continue.
So things really fell apart beginning towards the end of the First World War. First World War ended at the very end of 1918 and into 1919 when the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and Germany was terribly penalized for having, at least in the belief of the Allies, having started the war. The Treaty of Versailles required the reparations of, at that time, 33 billion US dollars, which is a fabulous amount of money. Inflation was wildly rampant in Germany. Over a period of months, entire fortunes were wiped out by inflation. In months, it went from 4 to the dollar to over billion marks to the dollar. And so people were suffering very severely. Lonard had terrible financial reversals himself, and his son had died during the war, Werner. Werner was a sickly child. It was a terrible disappointment to Lonard, who was an arch nationalist, that his son, because of his illnesses, had not been able to participate in the war, but died of a nephrotic syndrome, a kidney disease, during it anyway. Lonard was easy pickings for the right-wingers, the extreme right-wingers, and the right-wingers postulated, and it was a common shibboleth to believe, that the Jews were at fault, that the Jews controlled the international money markets, and Lonard picked up on this as well. So over time, what became concerns about science became very personal. Lonard personalized his anger at the Jews in the form of Einstein. Einstein was the Jew he knew, the Jew who was becoming very popular in Germany. Envy certainly was an important factor as well, but things broke down between them, and there was really no correspondence following the last letter that was sent prior to the war.
Was Einstein the first scientist in today's parlance we would call a rock star?
Okay, so that's an interesting story. Einstein, I mentioned that Lonard in 1905 won the Nobel Prize. 1905 was not a bad year for Einstein either. It's been now known as his miracle year, where out of nowhere, this patent clerk working in Bern, who had his PhD, but really his first degree was just to be able to teach physics and mathematics. He earned his PhD in 1905 after some difficulties, but out of nowhere, he published these 5 remarkable papers. The 3 best known: one, the photoelectric effect, the law of the photoelectric effect. He explained Brownian motion, which became the foundation for colloidal chemistry. And he talked about time and space, the relationship between time and space and mass and energy in his special theory of relativity. And overnight, he really started to climb the ladder. He got himself an academic job, which incidentally paid well less than being a patent clerk in Bern, and then started to move around. He went to Prague, he came back to Zurich. In 1914, Max Planck personally recruited him to be the head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin and professor at Berlin University, and with a lot of special perks that most of the other professors at the time didn't get. Lonard hated this, and when asked, in fact, originally to allow him into the society, the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, by Planck, because he knew that Lonard might be a problem here, the response was, well, simply because a goat resides in a stable doesn't make him a thoroughbred racehorse. In 1919, important things happened. Einstein had finished working on his general theory of relativity in 1915, had delivered a series of lectures that were really quite convincing. Germans were coming over to this Jewish man's side. He was the term for people like Einstein was he is un-German, which of course was a euphemism for something else. But in 1915, he gave these lectures. He wrote up the general theory. He wrote a book that you and I can read, that I actually read, in fact, very short, called The Theory of Relativity, the Special and General Theories. And he made some cosmological predictions. He predicted that, first of all, light would bend by gravity. So light from distant stars passing close to our sun would actually bend and arrive at a different point than when they were not aligned with our sun. He also predicted how the course of Mercury would alter from Kepler's version. Kepler was the one who originally described the course of the planets around the sun, but it was supposed to be an even source, where every time the point closest to the sun would be the same. It didn't occur that way. The perihelion of Mercury, as it's called, was different on every passage, and Einstein explained via relativity how that occurred. And finally, he predicted a shift in the light spectrum. The sun, the light in the sun versus the light as it arrived on Earth. In 1919, one of those predictions came true. Anybody know what happened in 1919 that allowed the proof? This gentleman. What do you do for a living, sir?
Retired engineer.
There you go.
Retired engineer.
Yeah, good. So others know as well. Good, yes. There was an eclipse of the sun in 1919, and England sent out, the Royal Society sent out parties to the west coast of Africa and to Brazil. And they validated Einstein's prediction. In fact, the sun did bend light from stars that were adjacent to it. And the crowds went wild. The newspapers said that everything had been turned on its head, that old Newtonian physics no longer held, and that Einstein was this literally rising star. So overnight he became famous, and Lonard hated this. He thought, well, first of all, he was an arch-Newtonian. He was not about to give up on Newton and Kepler and Copernicus, his German stars. And here was this man who was getting much more publicity than he should. He felt publicity he was due, of course, and that it was just, he posed it instead that this was unworthy of people in science. And so that was added to all the other of Einstein's failings, plus the fact that he was growing increasingly radical and increasingly anti-Semitic.
Just continuing the background here, what was the Working Society of German Scientists?
Okay, so this was the reaction of Lonard and maybe 10 or 12 other German scientists. They were going to take down Einstein. They were going to show him for a fraud. They were going to show the theory of relativity as pure charlatan, really. So Lonard, trying to stay in the background, nonetheless talked to the man who they hired, essentially hired to take on this task, a man named Paul Wieland, who called himself an engineer but couldn't really produce any credentials. No offense, sir. But he was more of a rabble-rouser. He roused the extremist right wing. And he agreed to develop a series of lectures, 20 lectures, 2 per night, that would be held over 10 nights in a large hall, the Berlin Philharmonic Hall, over a period of a month or 2. And that was called the Working Society to keep I can't remember exactly, Working Society of German Scientists for the Purity of Science. And the notion was these lectures would just take down Einstein, and that would be that. So the very first pair of lectures, the Nazis, but not just the Nazis, believe it or not, there were more extremists than that, surrounded the hall. They would they're selling their pamphlets and pins and so forth. And Einstein attended too. And he sat up in the crowd, and he listened to this, his stepdaughter, Margot, beside him, and made fun of the whole thing, made very light of it, made jokes about what was going on the stage as Wieland first began, and as he brought out a man named Gerke, a scientist. He wasn't as amused as he appeared. He thought about it for a few days, and he wrote an article about what he called the corporation, or Scientists Incorporated. And he published it in one of the German dailies, the one that happened to be Jewish-owned. And it raised an enormous fuss, because not only did he pick on the people who had publicly participated and were scheduled to participate, he picked on Lonard. He said Lonard is behind this, with no real proof to that effect. And so it raised an enormous ruckus. Lonard basically accused Einstein of slander, and eventually Einstein recanted, but only recanted through others' voices, his friends' voices. He did not actually recant to any great extent. Now, what followed here, you'd say, well, okay, big fuss over nothing. But within about a month and a half of that, the German scientists, all of them, the physicists, the chemists, the mathematicians, were all to get together for their very first meeting after the First World War. And it was an especially important meeting because the German scientists were banned from all other European meetings. There was enormous hard feelings that dated back to certain episodes that occurred in the First World War. And so this meeting was really all they had. And Einstein threw out a challenge. He said he was willing to debate anyone who felt the theory of relativity was false. And of course, nobody came forward immediately, but there was plotting in the background. And Lonard was the ringleader. They were originally going to meet in Frankfurt. It turned out there was a great deal of political unrest in Frankfurt, so they met in a tiny spa town called Bad Nauheim. And Bad Nauheim went on for 3-4 days. It was all very calm. But on the final day, that was when the powers that be had scheduled the debate, where Einstein would stand the test of the field, everybody else in the building. And there were two burly guys flanking the gates. The physicists and the chemists were the sort of special people who got in first. And then anybody else from the news, the media. And Weiland was there as well, Paul Weiland. And it was supposed to be open discussion, but in fact it very quickly degenerated into sort of name-calling between Lonard and Einstein. First some science, then some degeneration of name-calling, finally two children bickering over a toy is how I would describe it. At the end, Einstein, nothing had been settled, of course. At the end, Einstein chased after Lonard to the cloakroom. Lonard said, "It's too late." He ran for the train, and they never spoke personally ever again. And so it would have been fine, I think, if, except for Bad Nauheim, maybe the whole thing would have just been buried under. But from that moment on, the anti-Semitism that Lonard had been hiding came forward, and there was nothing but vituperative commentary about Einstein, the failings of his hypotheses and his theories, until Einstein was finally chased from Germany in 1933.
Yeah, didn't Einstein's personal life also factor into the criticism of all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Einstein was so different from Lonard. Lonard was a very serious man, and he, as I said, he treated people poorly in general, but his underlings he treated very poorly. They were special case. Einstein, on the other hand, was an extraordinary wit. For instance, in 1919, when the proof, the solar eclipse showed him to at least be right once on one of his predictions, he was asked by a newspaper, well, can you explain for people what relativity is all about? And the way he answered was, well, if you're with a pretty girl, an hour seems like a second. But if you're sitting on a red-hot cinder, a second seems like an hour. And Einstein was quite the ladies' man. First of all, he was a very attractive man before the whole hair thing happened later in his life. And the hair thing happened to me, too, just in reverse. But he was quite the ladies' man, and he loved women, but in a very sexist way, of course. I mean, he once referred to American husbands as the lapdogs of their wives. He referred to marriage as the attempt to turn an incident into an unsuccessful attempt to turn an incident into a permanent relationship. So, and he was a philanderer. I mean, the fact is that he cheated on his first wife, Mileva Merrick, and he also cheated on his second wife, Ilse Lowenthal, Ilse Einstein. And he told them about it. So in that respect, he wasn't the kindest of men. but mostly the world adored him. He always had an interesting thing to say. There are many, many anecdotes. I mean, I don't know how much time we have, but certainly there are many.
Yeah. And so from reading the book, it seemed to me that there was this issue of pure thinking versus this kind of fuzzy thinking. And at some point, Einstein's approach to science to relativity was compared to moral relativism.
Yes.
The lack of absolutes.
Yes.
And that didn't sit well in that society.
Germanic society being what it was, it had nothing to do, one had nothing to do with the other, but the anti-Einstein forces sort of took advantage of this relativism that was also beginning to occur in society, German society. Post-World War I, the very Prussian atmosphere, even in Berlin, was held up during the day, but at night it was sort of times of gaiety, like the world was about to end, and perhaps it really was. So relativism had nothing to do with relativity, but again, I mean, they were trying everything to take Einstein down, and that was one thing. I mean, I remember one quote particularly. I'm not sure I'm going to get it exactly right, but Lonard compared Einstein, and by Einstein he meant all of the theorists, to the early 20th century painters, the Picassos, the other Cubists. Basically, he said, well, they couldn't paint, so they made up something they could paint. And Einstein and his group don't really understand science, so they made up something that they could live with as well. It was that kind of bickering. Einstein tried to stay out of it. Einstein was, as I said, very popular for a while in German society. What took him down was, first of all, the constant hammering away by the anti-Einstein forces. But he also was very different than the rest of the German scientists. The German scientists were really very, very strongly nationalistic. Even the Plancks and the Sommerfelds, the so-called good guys, the Renkins, they were very nationalistic following the war. Einstein was an internationalist. He once called nationalism the measles of humanity. So he was an internationalist. He was a pacifist. He was very much against the rearming of Germany, and so he slowly but surely public opinion began to turn on him.
So Lonard was supported at the highest levels of the Nazi regime.
Yes.
Even to being able to have met with Hitler on
Right.
one or more occasions. Why were these issues of science so important to the Nazis?
Well, it meshed so well with their philosophy, their broader philosophy. So if you can read pieces of Mein Kampf, which is, I mean, very hard to read, quite frankly, it matches Einstein's ideas of culture and science in Germany. Excuse me just a moment. I have to tell you, I forgot to take some medication. I've got to do it.
Okay.
So I'm trying to work it out of my pocket while I continue talking. Tell you what, I'm just going to stand up for a second, if you don't mind. C-SPAN, I don't know about that. We didn't work this out ahead of time. At any rate, so Lonard developed a philosophy that he called Deutsche Physique, or Aryan Physics. And in 1933, just about the time Hitler was consolidating his power, he'd been appointed as chancellor the year before. The burning of the Reichstag had occurred early on. He'd managed to get the parliament, the Reichstag, to disband itself. This is quite a trick, and the book goes into some detail about how and why he did that. It all fit so well, Deutsche Physique, with the Hitler philosophy. And Deutsche Physique basically posed that there were differences in the way different people thought about science, and that that this was related to their ethnicity and their nationalism, and that really all great physics derived from, you guessed it, Aryan physics. Excuse me a moment. Aryan Physics, and he went through some of the others. He said, well, Negro physics, that's not known yet. Arabian physics used to be important, but that was centuries ago. And finally, of course, he got to Jewish physics. And he decided that Jewish physics not only was a bad thing for physics, it was a bad thing for the culture of Germany. Because Einstein's made sense to other people, younger physicists in Germany who could understand the mathematics. Lonard was in no position to judge the so-called Jewish physics because he didn't have the mathematical background. He didn't want the mathematical background. He thought the whole thing was a hoax. But what really got him wasn't just that Einstein was getting more and more prominent and that more and more people were accepting his notion of physics. It was the Germans, his people, that were coming over to Einstein's side. And so he hoped this book, the introduction to which was, again, a rambling, almost unreadable cursing of Jews and theoretical physics, and then 3 other volumes that were a recanting of all the lectures he had given over his lifetime in physics. By all accounts, he was a fabulous physics lecturer. Mileva Maric, before she married Einstein, actually took a semester in Heidelberg, where at that time Lonard was doing a visiting professorship for a year. And she wrote Einstein about this man he'd never heard of before and what a fabulous lecture he gave over the speed of electrons in solution. So that's basically, the philosophy. The reason is the philosophy that Lonard was touting for years and years had crystallized to become almost identical to Hitler's and the Nazis.
So having thought about this a lot, as you have, I'm sure, is there any validity to the concept that different ethnic groups have different scientific mindsets?
I think it's unquestionable that when you talk about subjects like language or culture, that there are enormous differences. Not to say one's better than the other, which of course he did. In science, I like to think of science much more as something that's really international. International in the sense that, and this is an example, for instance, where, let's say in Germany, somebody comes with a new experimental finding. And that finding is sent by journals, even then, journals and speaking engagements around the world. And in Japan, someone shows up and presents this material, and the Japanese, who have been working very hard on something, but to no avail, plug in this new piece of information, and suddenly the experiment works, and we all learn a little more about how our universe operates. Do I think it's possible that there are cultural influences in science? I guess I do. But much, much less so, and much less deterministically than they are in cultural subjects. That was quite the opposite of what Lonard told us.
So Lonard and his various colleagues came to a position of power, and that and just the general situation with the Jews in Germany
Right.
forced a lot of scientists out.
Right.
And so that created a shift in the world's balance of scientific intellect,
Right. So
away from Germany to its enemies. What was the result of that?
That's the subtitle, How Nazi Scientist Philippe Lonard Changed the Course of History. Lonard did have Hitler's ear. Now, he was already quite advanced in age at this point, in his 70s, but he had the foresight to take on a much younger acolyte, a man named Johannes Stark. And Johannes Stark had started out actually as a believer in quantum theory, but later joined the experimentalists. Came to that. Basically ruined his own career by complaining when he lost a job to Sommerfeld's candidate. And he wrote a long diatribe that basically insulted physics and physicists throughout Europe. And so when other jobs came up, he wasn't getting them. He'd apply. They'd say thank you, but no thank you. But suddenly, when the Nazis came to power, Stark was in because he had been helping Lonard all along. he had been an apologist, in fact, a supporter of Lonard's claim to the discovery of the X-ray. He had been a apologist and supporter throughout the anger that occurred over Einstein. As I said, they finally did manage to keep him from returning to Germany, probably saved his life by keeping him from coming back at a certain point. And so Stark and Lonard suddenly were popular with the Nazis. They were empowered. Stark gained two very powerful positions in German science. Lonard had no pretensions to such important positions. He just wanted to vanquish Einstein forever. He wanted the name to never be heard again. He wanted Einstein's work not to be believed again. And when the law in 1933, the law for the reconstruction of the German civil service came about, they pounced. That law was the law that said basically, if you were Jewish, this is really cutting through a lot to get to the bottom line. If you were Jewish or a communist, you couldn't work in the German civil service. Now, you know who were civil servants? All the professors in all the universities. And so it created this situation where Stark and Lonard were able to cleanse, if you will, the German universities. If you don't mind, I'll read a page or two, actually, of what went on here. At 10:45 on the morning of May 16, 1933, Max Planck's driver, Planck, of course, being the most advanced of the German scientists, or most revered, helped the dean of German physicists from the back seat of his car. Planck stepped onto the curb of Berlin's Wilhelmstrasse, running alongside the chancellery. Despite a cold, gusting wind tickling his memory of what had been a harsh winter, Planck stood motionless for a brief moment, surveying his surroundings. The chancellery was an impressive Rococo palace that had served as the seat of German government since 1875. Planck once thought its graceful symmetry a harmonious example of Prussian architecture. That was no longer the case, not since the Weimar government had erected the crass, modern south wing. It was a stain that was impossible to ignore. For better or worse, change was inevitable. As president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, Germany's most prestigious scientific organization, Planck had sought the opportunity to speak with Adolf Hitler, the newly appointed chancellor, on the current situation and future plans of the society. He had made certain to arrive at the chancellor's offices a few minutes early so he could settle his nerves and think about several issues that had arisen since Hitler had taken office. Chief among his concerns was a new law, this was the 1933 law, that mandated the dismissal of non-Aryan civil servants. The word non-Aryan was a euphemism for Jewish. Since all faculty and staff of German universities were classified as civil servants, the law threatened the continued employment of all Jewish professors. Indiscriminate enforcement of the new law would result in the dismissal of many of Germany's elite scientists, chemists, and mathematicians, and irreparably hinder the progress of German science for years to come. This would be Planck's only chance to reason with Hitler. He would need to keep his wits about him if he were to have any chance of getting through to him. As a secretary ushered him into Hitler's office, Planck considered how he might effectively address the concerns in a way that Hitler would understand. He decided to use as an example his Jewish colleague, Fritz Haber. Anybody know about Fritz Haber? Good. The Nobel laureate had recently resigned his university position in protest of the new law. Haber was Jewish. Haber was a national hero for his invention of processes for producing poisonous gases during the Great War, without which Germany would have lost from the start. Planck broached the subject delicately, but Hitler was immediately on the alert. "I have nothing against Jews as such," Hitler said, "but all Jews are communists, and it is the latter who are my enemies. It is against them that my fight is directed." "There are different types of Jews," Planck said, "both worthy and worthless ones to humanity, with old families of the highest German culture among the former." He suggested a distinction should be made of the various sorts. "That's not right. A Jew is a Jew," Hitler objected. "All Jews stick together like burrs. When there is a Jew, all kinds of Jews gather right away. It should have been the duty of the Jews themselves to draw a dividing line between the various types. They did not do this, and that is why I must act equally against all Jews. Planck said forcing worthy Jews to emigrate would be equivalent to mutilating ourselves outright because we direly need their scientific work. And their efforts would otherwise accrue primarily to the benefit of foreign countries. The chancellor ignored the comment. After an uncomfortable minute, Hitler said, "People say I suffer occasionally from nervous disability. This is slander. I have nerves of steel." As if to prove how sturdy he was, he began to bang his fist on his knee, and he spoke extremely fast, beating himself into a great fury. Planck was left with no choice other than to remain silent and take his leave. So it's exactly right. 1,400, roughly 2,000 Jewish scientists, chemists, mathematicians were forced out of their jobs. That included 14 Nobel Prize winners, by the way. And the ones that could get out all went to places like the United States and England and Russia, all enemies of Germany in the Second World War, and had a very great effect.
So lots of loathing, politics, ego there, but you never have had that in science since, right?
Exactly. So this is why I write this kind of work. It's very hard, and maybe this is the exception. I mean, that you're here say you are an exception. Maybe you could pick up a science book and read it, but very few people want to do that anymore. And I see this kind of work, putting science in the context of an interesting story, an instructive story, as a way to get people to actually be interested in learning science. And has it happened again? Well, there's enormous, of course, people are all very familiar with the line that academic politics are the most vicious because there's so little at stake. It goes on and on. My next book, one that I hope will be out this fall, it's sort of in the proof stage, goes into, again, many of the same themes about academic politics and how they bring down even very talented individuals. So, no, it's certainly nothing novel. It's just on a much grander scale.
And you've had some reactions to this book that really bolster your feelings about making reading about science interesting.
Yeah.
And I know you got one you wanted to share.
This is, it's amazingly, this came yesterday. I hope I can find it very quickly on my cell phone. Yeah. So I have some hobbies in addition to writing, one of which is playing golf. And I play down in Durham, or used to play down in Durham an awful lot. I live in Wake Forest, North Carolina now. And one of my playing partners actually bought a book. This is why, so nobody can live off books. They keep lending it out. You can't live on an income because people don't actually buy them. They just give them to their friends. At any rate, one friend that they gave it to wrote back to say the following: "Thanks so much for sharing the Einstein book. I am hoping I can hold on to it a bit longer for Richard, her husband, to read it too. Richard's mother earned her PhD in physics under Arnold Sommerfeld, one of the white Jews." Now, we didn't get into white Jews, but white Jews were people who weren't Jewish, but who believed in Einstein and sympathized with theoretical physics. So at any rate, in physics under Arnold Sommerfeld, one of the white Jews, by some error, she and Edward Teller, father of the hydrogen bomb, were assigned the same dissertation topic to solve. Teller's solution was more complete, and his solution is the one cited now. I have never seen Dr. Strangelove, but I am hoping to stream it. It talks in here about how Teller is thought to be the model for the mad scientist in Dr. Strangelove. When Richard's parents emigrated to the U.S. in 1937, his mother had a job at Duke under Hertha Sponer, a famous physicist, who had been her lab instructor in Göttingen. Hertha later married James Franck. Many will recognize the name James Franck. James Franck of the Manhattan Project and the Franck Report, which basically recommended not dropping the atomic bomb. So she married Franck after his wife died. This is Richard's mother. Richard's parents left Durham because his father, an MD PhD, was unable to get a medical license in North Carolina. That's a separate story, how the U.S. treated immigrant Jews, or whether they allowed them even to emigrate. His mom died when he was 16. He thinks she was perfectly happy. I'm not so sure. Unless she felt she'd seen too much with the war and loss of the world she knew and just wanted to hide away. So you could never have guessed how exciting Bruce's book would be to us. Out of nowhere, this is why, certainly it's why I write, I suspect it's why most people write and publish, because you don't know who's out there. And occasionally you can actually change thought or change lives. And this was just wonderful to receive. So thank you for allowing me to read that.
Sure, thanks. So we have time for some questions from the audience. If there are any, please raise your hand. I'll call on you and then wait for our volunteer with the mic, and this gentleman over here.
Could you talk a little bit about the research process that you went through for this book?
Yeah.
Do you speak German? Did you travel to Germany, etc.?
Yeah, ich spreche this. I speak a little German, but the fact is, first, many of Einstein's papers have been translated. About half of his papers have been translated. It's an enormous project, international project to do so. But if you look at the book's cover, and you can tell a lot by a cover sometimes, there are two German co-authors. One is Birgit Ertel-Wagner, who is also a radiologist and a physician in Germany, in Munich, and her husband Bernd Wagner, originally a historian but now in business. And they're good friends. Birgit was a fellow under me when I was running a large clinical trials operation, and she came over as a fellow for 2 months. And we've been friends ever since, and so they did translating and editing and a lot of other things as part of their authorship.
Anybody else? This lady over here. Wait for the mic, please.
Could you tell us a little bit about Renkin and Lonard?
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. It's chapter 6 in the book. And what happened was Lonard, as I mentioned, had been working, a younger man than Renkin, had been working in the area of cathode rays. And he almost certainly had seen signs of the X-ray. But like so many people in science, they saw what they expected to see. They didn't take, and this is a big theme in my next book called The Plague on All Our Houses. Everybody sees what they expect to see except the unusual individual who sees something new and makes the discovery. And Lonard didn't do that. So when Renkin, on November 8th, 1895, did see and recognize that it wasn't the cathode rays that was making his cardboard covered with platinum-cyanide light up, he missed an enormous opportunity. He was very, very resentful. And when he won the Nobel Prize in 1905, this is Lonard, Renkin won the very first one in 1901, which Lonard thought was just very unfair, that at the very least they both should have been named. But when Lonard finally won in 1905, he really took down Renkin hard. He said that, again, that this was not the man who should be credited with the discovery of the X-ray, that it was really he. When Renkin wrote his will, his last will, he ordered all of his papers be burnt, except a letter he had received from Lonard many years earlier crediting him with the discovery of the X-ray. And when the Nazis came to power, the folks in Würzburg photocopied it, primitive photocopying, and they had many copies spread around Germany and elsewhere in Europe and even to Japan, so that Lonard would never be able to have the sole copy of that letter and destroy it, or Lonard's forces, the sympathizers. So that's a great story, too. It's actually one of my favorite chapters in the book.
Other questions?
Sounds like a fascinating book. Thank you. I don't believe in glib comparisons, but it makes me very concerned when there's a distrust of science by a society and a slander of it. Mm-hmm. And it seems currently in our country that certain people say that there's a real America and another America, and that they wouldn't want a Harvard professor helping them if their car broke down. I mean, certain politicians said that.
I have no idea who you're talking about.
And that global warming is just, climate change is a hoax because it feeds so many salaries. What can we do now to help support our scientists, to support our intellectual community?
Well, I think first you can become scientifically literate yourself. I mean, the level of literacy in general in this country is very poor, and scientific literacy is much worse than that. And so, I mean, before you can start to debate or challenge the naysayers, you really have to understand a little of the science yourself, or at least understand at a level where you can communicate it and work with others who also can, who think similarly and who can communicate it as well. I think that's the biggest leap, to be perfectly honest, in combating, so that ordinary folk like you and me, we can understand it and we can combat it.
Well, good.
This gentleman
Is there
wanted to
another
ask
gentleman?
questions
Great.
as well.
Einstein is rightly highly regarded for his theoretical contributions, but he grew up in a family of what we today would call probably electrical engineers.
Mm-hmm.
They produced power, they
Yes.
made motors,
Yep.
and he probably did well as a patent clerk because he understood the practical aspects as well of the technology at that age. Did this facet of his background enter into his interactions with the rest of the community?
So I have no doubt it did, but I think really the patent clerk thing, the reason he was a patent clerk was he couldn't get a job in a university. Even though the university job would pay much less, he had married Merrick by that point in time. They'd actually had a girl named Lucille, but nobody knows what happened to Lucille, whether she died young or whether she was born out of wedlock back in Serbia, where Merrick had gone to give birth. And so nobody would even know about Lucille except it was found in one of Einstein's letters many years after his death. So his family is another story. They left Germany and went to Italy, and as you say, formed an engineering firm that was fairly successful, at least for a while. Einstein gave up his German citizenship at that point in time and finished high school in Switzerland, and then, of course, got all his education in Switzerland, too. It's impossible to say. He was never a student of engineering. As I said, he was a student of teaching math and physics. Merrick was also a student of teaching math and physics, but she never passed her final exams, so she never got her degree from the Zurich Polytechnic. Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this immensely.
Thank you, Bruce.